information this evening. Okay. I will call to order a public hearing at the meeting of the Planning and Economic Development Committee on Tuesday, January 15th at 7 p.m. in the Aldermanic Chamber. And if the clerk would call the roll, please.
Certainly, Madam Chair. Alderman Ernest-Jetty.
Here.
Alderman David Tenza.
Present.
Alderman Brendan Laws. Alderman Jan Schmidt. And of course, Alderwoman Melissa Golia.
Thank you. And also in attendance, we have Alderman Dowd. Thank you. So this public hearing is regarding Ordinance 18033, amending the land use code matrix regarding self-storage facilities and sanitary landfills. Prior to Alderman Dowd giving a brief explanation of the ordinance, I will just state that the ordinance was reviewed by the Planning Board on January 10th and unanimously given approval. So with that, I will ask Alderman Dowd to give us a brief explanation before I ask for testimony. Thank you.
Okay. 018-033 is to make a couple changes in the zoning ordinances. The first is fairly simple. It's that if you look at the zoning today, landfills are authorized in the general business area. That was done years ago when we had a small landfill off East Dunstable. We don't want to do that anymore. Obviously, general business property is very scarce in Nashua, and so we want to prohibit a landfill in a GB zone. Not that we'd ever put one there, but we want to ensure that it's not allowed. The other part of this is amending the land use codes for self-storage facilities. There are some parcels that in the past, GB, which is usually the first 200 feet of property adjoining a major artery, had the land behind it change from an industrial use to general business, which has much more intensive uses. So what we want to do is change the ordinance to allow for storage facility buildings that look like an office building that are 200 feet back from the street, which is through the general business. And the idea was we want to make this a conditional part of the ordinance for general business with the caveats that we got from the planning department. And what it does is it gives the planning board the authority to enact the requirements and allow or not allow the storage facility in a GB zone back 200 feet from the main artery. So the changes which were part of the approval from the planning board the other night that came from the planning department is that where the sentence that already exists on item 5, self-storage facilities designated with a subscript 2 must be at least 200 feet from the city right-of-way. The added verbiage, and all storage bay doors to be screened from view from all adjacent street frontages and residentially used properties, and a minimum landscape buffer of 40 feet is required from all adjacent residential used properties. Planning board may waive the 200-foot setback on a non-arterial right-of-way, meaning not a main street. Door screenings and 40-foot buffer as part of a conditional use application and a site plan application, provided they find there are no negative impacts on the abutter neighborhood or the city, in addition to the required criteria for waivers, NRO 190, 148D. Basically what it's saying is that back 200 feet, 40-foot buffer, but all of those items can be changed by the planning board if they find, say, 30 feet is okay because, it's dense woods or something. as opposed to 40 feet. So they have, it gives the planning board some control over the development of these buildings. Rather than going back and changing GB back to industrial, we don't want to keep doing that. So this gives the planning board much more flexibility.
Okay, and I would just add, as Alderman Dowd indicated, the additional language that he read to you is what has been recommended by the planning board. We would have to move to amend the ordinance because they cannot just amend this. So he's presented an overview of the ordinance in addition to the recommended language for amendment that came from the planning board. And if the record could indicate, Alderman Lopez arrived at 7:05, and he texts me at 7 o'clock. He was stuck on Main Street, so glad you made it. Thank you. So with that, I am going to open the public hearing, and is there anyone who would like to give testimony in favor? If you would come to the mic and state your name and address for the record, please.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Your electronic engineer that's around somewhere told me I'd better come sit here
Okay.
than on that one. It was better
He knows.
mic.
Okay, I would just say, make sure the mic is close to you, because otherwise he's going to be waving at us or knocking on a wall. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Something.
For the record, my name is Gerald Prunier. I'm an attorney with office at 20 Trafalgar Square here in Nashua, and I'm here to speak in favor of this ordinance. What's happening in the city is that we're getting less and less land, and there is less ability to do some of the projects in the city. This storage facilities was allowed in Park Industrial, but a lot of the Park Industrial land is now becoming general business or in business areas. And this is the storage facilities are very little traffic and very little noise. So it's something that you like to have. However, they don't have to be on the public thoroughfare right away because people know where they are. So the planning staff, when they discussed with them, indicated that they were in favor of this, especially if it could keep it back off the major thoroughfare where businesses have to be. They need the exposure to the general public. So we worked on this ordinance, and we also worked to give the planning board some flexibility. The pieces of property that are vacant that are left in the city are either small, rectangle, maybe different sizes. This gives the planning board to look at the piece of property, its location in that particular area, and try to help make it palatable to put it in that area. And it gives some flexibility to the developer to, if he wants to be creative, then both sides win and something can be done. While I was doing this, I noticed that the sanitary landfills could be put in general business, so I suggested to the planning staff that while we're doing this, we might as well take sanitary landfills out of that since we didn't want it. And that's all I have to say. We went to the planning board, and they went unanimously, I believe it was, Dave, that was. And so we feel that this will be a help to the development of the city of Nashua. And I hope that I can come before you with more innovative parts to the zoning ordinance to make the development of the city more organized, more available, and better for everyone involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prunier. Seeing no one else here, I will call for testimony in opposition. Testimony in favor. Did you forget something, Mr. Prunier, you'd like to add? Testimony in opposition. Seeing none, I will declare the public hearing closed at 7:09 p.m. I'm now going to call to order a meeting of the Planning and Economic Development Committee on Tuesday, January 15th, 2019, at 7:10 PM in the chamber. And if the clerk would call the roll, please.
Alderman Ernest Jettie.
Here.
Alderman David Tenza. Alderman Brandon Laws. Alderman Schmidt is here, and Alderwoman Malisi Goya.
Thank you. And we also have Alderman Dowd and Alderman Lopez with us. Public comment? Seeing none. Communications,
There are none.
unfinished business,
None as well.
new business resolutions,
None of those.
and new ordinances.
We have ordinance 18-033, amending the land use code use code matrix regarding self-storage facilities and sanitary landfills.
Do I have a motion for, yes, Alderman Tenza?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
would you like me to make a motion for final passage?
Yes, please, and then we will have discussion.
Okay, so I'd like to make a motion for final passage of 018-033.
Okay, thank you. So you've all heard the motion, and you heard Mr. Alderman Dowd's summary of the changes that were recommended, as well as the summary of the ordinance. And before we go any further, Alderman Tenza, as the liaison to the planning board and actually a member of the planning board, is there anything else you would like to add
No,
to
I
the
don't,
comments?
I mean, I think the explanation we got at the planning board the other night on the 10th was similar to what we had here, and I don't believe there were any real concerns or comments. I think it passed unanimously without really much hesitation.
Okay, thank you. So you've all heard the recommended amended language. Do I have a motion? Alderman Tenza?
I'd like to make a motion to amend 018-033 as outlined in the memorandum dated January 9th, 2019, to Scott Leclerc and members of the planning board from Roger Houston, planning director.
Thank you. And that is an amendment regarding the interpretation of number 5 in table 15-1, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you have all heard the amendment. Is there any discussion regarding the amendment? Alderman Jettie? And then Alderman Dowd.
So first of all, I'd like to say that, you know, if the planning board or the planning staff wants to, you know, recommend that we do something, that we amend something, it would be helpful if they, you know, sent this to us in advance. Handing it to us at the meeting as we're sitting down is, you know, is not the, I don't think, the best way to handle this. If I had, I'm not saying that I find any fault with what they're recommending, but I would have appreciated some time to read it before tonight so that I could, you know, analyze it and formulate any questions I might have if I had any. You know, that's just a, and it's, and this happens a lot. And I know I do the same thing, so I'm not, you know, trying to cast stones from a glass house. But just as in general, if the city staff would be cognizant of that and think to themselves, if I asked them to do something, wouldn't they want to know about it ahead of time rather than just handing it to them on the spot? That being said, I do have a question about, I'm looking at the use matrix, table 15-1, and I'm looking at it and I'm seeing that that under 193 self-storage facility, under general business, there are 2 dashes on top, and then there's a C with a superscript 2, and then a line underneath that. What is that? Does anybody know what that means?
Alderman Dowd?
Yeah, the C is a conditional approval. It means that it's not just allowed by fact. It has to go to the planning board and meet the conditions and in order to be approved. Also, the wording didn't come to this committee until after the planning board met because they didn't in this case, but they could reject what the planning department wanted to add for words, or they could add to them or change them. And so when it comes to this meeting, we had to know exactly what they approved. And the meeting was, when was the meeting?
The meeting was the 10th, and I actually just became aware of the language because Mr. Houston gave me a heads up on the change because the minutes weren't available, but I had listened to the minutes, so that's how I was aware of it prior to getting it from him. Yeah, but he recognized that even if we had looked at minutes wouldn't have been posted. Yes, Alderman
Yeah, a
Dowd.
couple other points. In the presentation from the planning department, Roger Houston to the planning board, with that wording, that has the full support of the planning department, including Director Marchand. Also, Carter Falk looked at all of the properties that might fall into this criteria. There are very few where you would be able to put this. So it's not impacting a lot of land in Nashville. It's a few spots that you could put one of these facilities in, be back 200 feet, have the 20 feet buffer. And that's along all the major arteries. I have this stack of drawings that at first when I got it, I had no idea what the heck it was trying to tell me until I realized it was the 200-foot line that they drew. So this is probably one of other changes that will be coming forward. Director Marchand would like to look at the zoning in the entire city. We have a lot of convoluted zoning changes that have been made over the last 30 years, and she would like to get them more in line with what it really should be. Some of them will come with the ability for the planning board when they're addressing a site to be able to make the determinations of how it best fits into the site.
And I would just follow up that I think all of us have been part of conversations regarding the need to make some of these changes to give the planning board a little more support. And in the absence of updating the master plan, using this to provide some support for planning board going and zoning in making their decisions. So any other comments? Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
No
Alderman
problem.
Schmidt.
I would just like to know if this came about because of a specific question. If someone had asked for this zoning change?
There was a location where it would either have required changing a GB zone to industrial, back to an industrial. It was industrial before. And probably if we had more flexible zoning back then, we wouldn't have changed it to a GB. We would have left it a industrial and made gave it the planning board ability to do that. And it's allowed in industrial zones. So this one particular lot that's being considered, which isn't final by any means, but was industrial before, and it was changed to GB. As far as the neighbors are concerned, the GB use is far more intense than this would be. This is very limited traffic. It's going to look like a regular building, not obtrusive. It's not the one level orange doors thing. It's more like the one on Somerset Drive. So this is just going to allow it to go back through the system. It will still be up to the planning board as to whether it's allowed or not. So I think that answered
Thank you.
your
Yes,
question.
yes. Thank you, thanks.
Just one other thing. In a GB zone, you could have a filling station, you could have a restaurant, which is far more intrusive to the residential neighborhood than what this is.
Any other comments, questions? Alderman Jettie?
So, if I could, through you, if I could ask Alderman Tenza, you, whom I assume was at the meeting where this amendment was discussed.
Yes.
I'm, I would like to know more about the ability of the planning board to waive some of these requirements. I'm, I'm somewhat weary of, you know, I hate to make enemies of the planning board, but I've already made enemies of the zoning board, so I guess I can group them. I might as well. But I've seen the zoning board, grant variances, and and where people who are not direct abutters, but live in the neighborhood, have an objection, but they have, the board, whether it's the zoning board or the planning board, the zoning board has, granted variances over the objections of neighbors. And if you're not a direct abutter, you have no recourse. Only direct abutters can appeal the decision of the zoning board to the Superior Court. And so you've got people who live in an area, and if if the planning board decides that they're going to waive the 200-foot setback, then what, unless you're a direct abutter, you're a direct abutter is put in a position of having to appeal that. But if you're not a direct abutter, you have no right to appeal that. And I'm wondering if, what the discussion was, and Alderman Tenza, if you could help me understand why they included this ability of the planning board to waive these requirements.
Alderman Tenza.
Sure, and I mean, I think in part of it was that this was the language that was proposed by planning staff, so they believed that the parameters that they put in here as a suggestion would be sufficient regardless of where a self-storage facility was put in, to make it so that the character of the neighborhood wasn't wasn't affected. So for things like the 40-foot buffer, and the 40 feet required is, I'm sorry, for landscape buffer. And so if I mean, the planning board at any point can reject a proposed plan if they don't believe that it's in the best interest, for it meets the criteria as set forth in the ordinances, in the RSAs. So I mean, there wasn't too much discussion. I mean, I think, from what I've seen in my year on the planning board is that members of the planning board take it pretty seriously, especially when there is when we get negative feedback from neighbors. But just because some of the neighbors may not like it, I don't think that necessarily dictates what the final decision of the planning board will be. And I mean, I would have to go back and look at this, but I think I think the planning board can set limitations or override any
proposal if there's good reason to do so. There's certain criteria. I don't have them in front of me here, but before every meeting, we're given the criteria that we need to look at in order to approve or deny any proposed plan. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Alderman Jettie?
Could I follow up?
Yeah.
So I don't, I think the planning board has certain criteria that they review. If the ordinance, if the second, I think it's the second, if the second sentence beginning planning board may waive the 200-foot setback, if that were eliminated from this and it was just that the self-storage facilities have to be at least 200 feet from the city right-of-way, and all storage bay doors to be screened from view from all adjacent street frontages and residentially used properties, and a minimum landscape buffer of 40 feet is required from all adjacent residentially used properties. If that was the ordinance that we passed, I don't think the planning board could waive that. The planning
Dowd.
board's ability to waive that would have to be empowered by this second sentence. And I'm finding some reluctance to, on my part, again, I'm just here, reading this for the first time, so.
The waiver is because if they went with a plan and to make it fit with the buffer zone and everything, it ended up being 195 feet back from the street, the planning board could say, okay, that's fine. None of these facilities that I've heard mentioned want to be on the street. They want to be back. The other thing is doing this with a conditional approval and keeping it a GB zone, but conditional use for this type of building. They're taxed as GB, which is much higher than industrial, so it actually makes more money for the city. But I don't think anybody on the planning board, from my experience, is going to allow one of these buildings up alongside the street. The general business they want up by the street, they want things like gas stations, restaurants, that type of thing.
Alderman Jettie? Oh, I'm sorry, and then Alderman Tenzer. Go ahead.
If I may,
Yeah.
just quickly too, I mean, I think too, when we're talking about self-storage facilities, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, but there are various ways that self-storage facilities are designed. Some of them are climate controlled and completely indoors and built, like any other building would be. So they're not all going to be these open bay kind of stores that we're thinking about. So giving the planning board that flexibility for a business like that may make sense. They could design the outside of a building which has the character as every other building, and you would never know that it's a self-storage facility. So I think what Director Marchant and Alderman Dowd are trying to come up with is just something that would fit different situations, so that these folks, when they don't want to develop this land, they don't have to come in and ask for it to be rezoned.
Alderman Jettie, I'm sorry.
So I like the idea of the 40-foot buffer, landscape buffer, required from all adjacent residentially used properties. I mean, I know that, I think currently there are self-storage facilities that have been built that are closer than that. Over the objection of neighbors. And so I like the 40-foot requirement. What I don't like is the ability to waive it. And I think personally, I think it's unfair of us to put the planning board in that situation. I mean, I think if they've got, set rules that that they have to abide by, I think it's easier for them. And I know that, we can all imagine in our own minds, what a project that we like the looks of might look like in our minds. But what the law deals with is, what is allowed by the law. And if a, when you say that the people who want to provide these self-storage facilities don't want it right on the highway, um, you know, that may be true, but it may not be true. I mean, if we adopt it the way it reads, they could propose it that way, and and the planning board could waive the setback, and there you go. Well, the same thing with the residential setback. I don't think, there are residential areas that are adjacent to highway business or general business areas, I believe. Um, I'm thinking of, I'm thinking of a particular self-storage facility that was constructed in my ward adjacent to a condominium development. And, all of a sudden, these owners of condominiums are looking at, the self-storage facility, and it's got the doors, that are painted, bright orange. And, it used to be trees, and now there's these bright orange doors facing them. So I just feel, it's important that we protect our residents from this type of thing. And I'm wondering if, I don't know, if it wouldn't make sense to have the planning department come and explain to us um, why this ability to waive this requirement is necessary, or why that's a good thing.
Alderman Dowd.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things here. One, anything that comes before the planning board gets a recommendation from the planning department, and the planning department is right there, two members of the planning department, Roger Houston and I forget her name, the other, Linda, I think. And they make a recommendation of the planning board, and the planning board, for the most part, sticks to the recommendation coming out of the planning department. And I know from discussions we've had that the planning department is not going to authorize in the areas that this ordinance would impact, would not allow any more storage facilities with the orange doors. It would only be a building that looks like an office building with doors that are hidden from Main Street site. And certainly the planning board and the planning department are not going to put these facilities on the street, and that's why they want them back 200 feet. I think we have to rely on the integrity of the planning board, because that's what they're there for. They're there to ensure the integrity of the developments of land in the city of Nashua. If we're trying to take powers away from them, I don't think that's the way we want to go. And I think that everybody involved is comfortable with the wording that came out of the memo from the planning department. And certainly everybody on the planning board felt comfortable. It was a unanimous vote, and there were, like Alderman Tenza said, there's basically no questions. So I think that it's good the way it's written, and the alternative would be to go in and change the zoning back to industrial, and then there'd be none of these requirements in that they could build it any way they want. it'd be allowed.
Right, and if I may just add, I did speak to Director Marchant, and in conversation with me and then also with Alderman Dowd, she felt that Alderman Dowd understood what was going on, and he was able to represent us and give the overview. And of course, Alderman Tenza was also at the meeting. So I think that, as Alderman Dowd has said to you, this actually gives a little more control than if it were to go back. So, Alderman Jettie.
So, um, when you say that that the planning board would not allow, that they're not going to allow orange doors, with all due respect, they have to abide by the law. And the law does not prohibit orange doors or neon green doors or yellow doors or any other color. And the planning board does not have the authority to prohibit that unless we gave them that authority in this law. The alternative is not to go back and as you say, to rezone it to industrial, and then we have no control at all. No, I think the alternative is that we adopt what they said about that we adopt this ordinance with the amendment that that the doors, the storage bay doors, be screened from view, as it says here, and that there be a minimum landscape buffer of 40 feet, and without giving them the power to waive that. That's the alternative that I see. We do everything that they asked except giving them the alternative of waiving these requirements. And so they would, in order to get, if the situation were appropriate, where the lot design was such that they couldn't do it, then the developer could go to the zoning board of adjustment and ask for a variance. But by adopting this the way it is, we're allowing the planning board to waive these requirements. We're saying these are the requirements, but you can waive them, and I'm not willing to do that.
Alderman Dowd?
So if they went and applied for a variance, you'd have to go through that process, and then you go to the planning board. And the planning board can still look at this criteria and decide yes or no. But it's going to cost the applicant a heck of a lot more time and money, and you end up with convoluted zoning again. We're trying to make the zoning much easier for people to go through, but if you're familiar with this type of facility that they wouldn't allow the one story with the orange doors. The
They've
planning
allowed it.
department would say no.
They've allowed it. I can show you.
We're talking, yes, but you gotta look at the wording on major arterial ways, Amherst Street, Daniel Webster Highway South, Main Street. They're not talking about other areas of city. If there's a park industrial land right up against the street in Ward 5 or Ward 3 or wherever, the building's allowed, and they can build it. In this instance, they have a lot more control over how the building looks, and they don't use, if you're familiar with the one on Southwood Drive, there are no orange doors. You go around the back, and there's glass doors, and you go through there, and everything's internal. This would be internal. It would not be one of those storage facilities. And I can tell you that the planning department would not allow that type of development to go through. They would recommend to the planning board that something like that be disapproved, and I'm sure from my experience with the planning board, it would be.
Alderman Tenza?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd also point out, so in our Ward 8, there's a storage facility right next to the fire station. Very nice landscaping. You would never even know that it's, the way it's set up, and it is open bays, but the bays don't face the road, and it's not quite residential. No, there's no residential property that abuts that, but there are apartments that are across the street. And I think, from what Attorney Prunier said at the planning board meeting, I think that's where these facilities are going to pop up, as near apartments, because people need the extra storage in those facilities, and that just kind of makes sense. But I don't know the facility you're speaking of, Alderman Jettie, but I mean, I think Alderman Dowd is right. If it's if it's zoned as industrial, there are no restrictions on it. So, if I may just I have a question for Alderman Dowd. The three zones where these facilities are permitted, was there ever any thought to making a conditional use for the three zones, the park industrial, airport industrial, and general industrial, making those conditional use for self-storage facilities as well? Or is there just not the need for it in those areas?
The, typically in those zones, they are allowed. They don't need to have any restrictions, or they can just build one. We did that, which was approved by this board, the overlay of the airport industrial zone off Amherst Street, because it's never going to be used for airport industrial again. So that overlay allows conditional uses for other things. Again, goes to the planning board, and the planning board looks at the criteria and makes their best decision for the city relative to the use of that land. I will say, from my time on the ZBA, that state law says that you cannot restrict the use of your property you own unduly. So cities can't make laws that will overly restrict the use of property. And this isn't the instance, but these conditional uses are the way that zoning is going. So it gives the planning board the right to make sure that the building or any facility that goes in that area, anything with a conditional approval, has to meet the conditions of the ordinance, and it gives them some ability to waive part of it, whether it's 40 feet to 39 feet, or 200 feet to 199 feet. And, in order for them to put a reasonable building in, that will be up to the planning board. And there's 8 members usually on the planning board, and that's 8 people that get to vote on it, and that's what they're there for.
Other comments, questions?
Madam Chair,
Yes, I'm sorry, Alderman Jettie.
I would like to, if I can, move to amend the amendment
Okay.
by striking the second sentence, beginning planning board may waive, and the remainder of that sentence, striking that part of the amendment.
Okay. So you've all heard the amendment to move that the planning board may waive the 200-foot setback and continuing through to the end of that. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
That motion fails. So we are back to the original amendment that was proposed, that came forward from the planning board meeting on January 10th. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? So the amendment passes. And Alderman Tenza, would you like to make a motion to recommend final passage as amended?
Yes. I'd
Okay.
like to make a motion to recommend final passage as amended of O18033.
Okay. And you have all heard the motion by Alderman Tenza. Any further discussion? Comments? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? And that motion carries. Public comment? I don't know if Mr. Premier's here now. No? Remarks by Alderman? Alderman Dowd.
Not on the committee, but I've been having several discussions with Director Marchand. She is undertaking in her spare time, which she has very little of, the look at zoning across the entire city. She feels there's a lot of areas that need improvement to be able to develop properties more in accordance with what the city's looking for from the planning department standpoint, and getting rid of old zoning that doesn't even apply anymore. So the problem is that that's a big undertaking, and it's part of an even bigger undertaking, which is updating the city master plan, which she has put in for again, but we don't know that it's going to be funded. Anybody on the?
It hasn't been presented to capital improvements
Okay.
yet.
So that's been ongoing to be updated for at least the last 5 years. And the city really should have an update to the master plan. But part of that is the zoning ordinances, which is a book about this thick, and doing it one chunk at a time. The airport industrial was the first one because it was very obvious that because of all the changes in the airport, that was never going to be used for airport industrial. It's still airport industrial, but now there's an overlay to that whole section from Sharon Avenue to up by the Santander Bank, I think, that allows you to do other things in that zone with the approval of the planning department. So there'll be a lot of changes coming. She would have liked to have done it in one fell swoop, but that's a huge undertaking of planning time and effort, and so it's being addressed by orders of priority. The 2 orders of priority are Amos Street and Daniel Webster Highway. Those are the big areas, and then the rest of the city will follow.
And I would just say to back it up even further, you will be receiving probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks the draft goals from the Strategic Planning Committee. And Director Marchand met with us last week, 2 weeks ago. And she and I have worked on kind of polishing up the draft goals. And they have been sent out to the committee members to comment on. But that's really a first step because it outlines where the goals of the city are, and they'll be used to drive how things happen in the city. And Director Marchand sees that as being, I think she referred to it as the backbone of doing the master plan. So as Alderman Dowd said, there's a lot we need to do. And I think that those of us who talk to members of planning board and the ZBA know that there's frustration that sometimes there just isn't good, up-to-date information for them to use in making decisions. Because as Alderman Dowd said, some things are outdated, and some of the uses that are being proposed, 20 years we didn't think about. So in looking at what's going on in the city and what we would like to see for the city, we really need to get on that. So I am hoping this year the money for the master plan will be approved. But we have yet to have that presentation at capital improvements. So as Alderman Dowd indicated, some of these things that are happening are to kind of get us through some of what needs to be done, and at least have some guidance for the developers who are coming in, as well as the members of the planning board and the zoning board who need to review this information. Any additional remarks? There's no, oh, I'm sorry, Alderman Lopez.
Want to remind anybody who's living in the tree streets that the Your Voice, Your Choice, I guess, reception, the second one is happening at Millette Manor tomorrow morning. I believe it's at 10 a.m. So it's an opportunity for people who are living in the neighborhood who are interested in micro improvements to the infrastructure to vote on different projects. So some of the more popular ones are garbage cans along the rail trail, so people have places to put things, or a bus shelter in front of Palm Square, or recently a Gaga pit has become very popular with children. So it's definitely worth checking out if you're nearby, and if not, check out the city website for more information.
Great, thank you. Um, Two things I just wanted to remind people about. I believe everyone received an invitation to the Nashua Regional Planning Commission's annual event in February. I want to say it's the 2nd, but I don't remember. But I would encourage you to attend. If you remember last year, there was conversation about housing. It was held at the courtyard, I believe. So just a reminder to check on that. The second piece is that at the next infrastructure meeting, there will be the presentation by the Rail Committee. There have been some other presentations and pieces that have happened with the Rail Committee prior to leading up to this final presentation. Their original presentation was, I think it was October 2017 to PEDC. I believe they've been to budget and they may have been to finance. So if you want to kind of do a little background looking, there are minutes from those meetings, and I will send you the minutes, the link to the minutes from PEDC, because Ms. Lovering and I had to dig around to find them because none of the search terms were bringing them up. But again, I would just encourage you to attend. And if you want some of the history, it's there in our minutes. Also, Empty Bowls is coming up the end of February, I believe. So something else that you might want to attend. Do I have a motion? Yes,
Just want to clarify. So I knew I was making a mistake as I said it. The Millette Manor event tomorrow morning is 9:15 to 10:15.
thank you. Do I have a motion?
Motion to adjourn?
Alderman Schmidt, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, and we are adjourned at 7:52. Thank you all.